Well, that last debate was really exciting, and I could, like you said, I could talk about this for days, just pay to win versus play to win. But a lot of Vladimir's points about gotcha-based monetization and optimization, I think, is a good segue into what I'm going to talk about. So, good afternoon, guys. I'm Devin. I'm the head of product management for the APAC region at EA, and I'm going to talk to you today about the importance of data-driven design in free-to-play, particularly in post-launch, when we're talking about live operations and live feature development. It's just critical that we use data as the roadmap to guide our decision-making. So I'm going to talk, go over my journey a little bit first, talk about a couple high-level concepts that are important to me, some success stories and what we learned from those. And I think we will have time for some questions after because we have a dropout. So I also won't have to rush through these slides. I packed a lot in here, so I think we may have some more time afterward to take questions and engage in some meaningful discussion, which is great. So my journey in free-to-play actually started on the M&A and private capital side, raising money and capital for some of the early pioneers of the free-to-play industry back when they were at their very early stage. After that, I kind of meandered through the tech industry for a while, even took some time to follow my passion as a pro gamer, which wasn't terribly successful, before landing at Kabam in the early days, and was fortunate to be part of the web game days and the early sort of first mobile explosion. Stayed on in Kabam in what I called the second mobile explosion, launching and scaling Marvel Contest of Champions, moving to Beijing to scale up a product team there and do basically the same thing in China. Before landing at EA, where I'm based in, thank you, based in Shanghai now, and my team focuses on the mid-core, pretty much the mid-core segment of games with a bunch of different types of IP. Mostly PC Online and mobile. FIFA Online and FIFA Mobile are two of our biggest titles. But we've got a lot of other things going on too. Red Alert has been a nice surprise for us. Apex is something coming down the pipeline, and PvZ has been something that has been a real surprise for us in China in terms of how strong the brand is and how long that game has been able to sustain. I also lived through the whole Battlefront fiasco and was able to help out the DICE teams in sort of thinking about, pay to win versus play to win, and is it the right thing to do in a console business model versus a free-to-play business model? And I think as a company, we're still existentially sort of wrestling with that question of pay to win versus play to win. But over the course of about 12 years, I've gone from someone who was really skeptical about the free-to-play business model and really only liked consoles and card games and RPGs to someone who's a true believer in the power of the business model and something that I think is going to be even bigger going forward. I want to talk to you first about a concept of the physics of free-to-play. And I tend to think about, physics because I think about, dynamic systems that are governed by certain rules of motion and gravity and things like that. And I tend to apply them to free-to-play. And one thing I really like about free-to-play when I compare it to the console business model is, how it behaves kind of as a dynamic system. You've got acquisition and players coming in from paid and organic sources and viral sources. You've got, unfortunately, players churning out and leaving the game, and we're obviously going to focus on bringing them back in any way that we can. But as players sort of move through that funnel to start paying and generating lifetime value, that then feeds into the ROI calculation that funds future acquisition, and it really does act as this system that's always alive. At the same time, there are so many things happening in this ecosystem. Social connections are being made. Battles are being fought, won and lost. Chats are happening. Different game modes are being played. And this is creating such a treasure trove of data for us that the onus is really on, and our players are really telling us basically what the gaps are and what to solve for, particularly in post-launch, when we want to launch new features in development and launch live ops and events and gotchas that are targeting our players. That data is really showing us the path. It's showing us what we need to solve for. And the onus is on us, and if we've got the right mindset and the right teams in place, then we're really able to do crazy things in terms of growing and scaling our products. The next concept I want to talk about is the concept of the North Star. And this is kind of a popular catchphrase in tech right now. Find your North Star metric and use it. Your North Star is basically the metric that really moves the needle for your games and your products. So it's important to identify the North Star in order to make the right decisions. But more than just a North Star. I think it's important, especially in gaming when you've got all this data in the game that's coming through and you're parsing through this, it's important to break your North Star metrics into their constituent parts, into their shards of the star, so to speak, so that you can understand what's really driving the North Star. A lot of times for a tech product, especially in mobile, retention is your North Star because these games are free to play. You want to keep players in them as long as you can so you can grow LTV and it doesn't asymptote too soon. And then LTV is another popular one, which has a lot of different components to it, right? But breaking down these components and understanding the different things that drives them is really important in order for you to design features and design events that can then move the needle on these different things, rather than just saying, hey, I want to increase retention, or hey, I want to increase LTV, I'm gonna launch an event. Okay, well, is that event the right one? What component of LTV are you trying to drive? Is it repeat purchase rate? Is it spend velocity? Is it ARPDAU, etc.? So these things are actually really important to understand early before you start to make those decisions. Let's walk through a quick example. So let's say that you and your team know that you want to drive a 90-day LTV of greater than or equal to $5, right? And you know from looking at your data that in order to do this, you need to create a 7-day sort of repeat purchase or redeposit rate greater than or equal to 10%. Well, once you've figured this out, the onus is on you to start looking into your behavioral data and start to understand and dig deeper into what drives that, right? So maybe what you'll do is you'll think about, all right, let's map out all my players into, on what day they actually repeat purchase, or if they ever did make a repeat purchase. And let's map that against the different game modes and the behaviors in the game that they're playing. You can do this pretty easily with something like a heat map. Say that you do this and you find out that, for players who are actually repeat purchasing, and this is dummy data, by the way, that they're spending an inordinate amount of time playing ranked synchronous PvP. So that's curious. But it's a good sort of guideline to say, okay, now the onus is on you to figure out how do we drive or increase the adoption of synchronous PvP, ranked PvP in your game, right? And then also looking into why is that a driver, right? These could be qualitative data points or quantitative data points. But it's not going to tell you, it's not going to point exactly to the feature that you want to design, but it's going to help guide you in the right direction, right? There are several different ways that you can increase sync PvP adoption, right? You can create PvP leaderboards. You could create more PvP-centric quests. You could optimize your PvP onboarding to get more people to stick around in PvP and get people to, come back more, increase the rewards of the value proposition of playing PvP versus other modes, right? But data is basically what you're going to use to get here, and that's going to allow you to point you in the right direction into designing and sort of optimizing PvP in your game. So enough about high-level concepts. Let's talk about some actual examples. I'm going to talk first about FIFA Mobile, which has been a real big success for us here in Asia. The gameplay engine itself is based on our global gameplay engine, but the game in Asia we've forked the build quite considerably and created a sort of tailored roadmap for Asian players, particularly in China, where we've got premium placement on WeChat and are working with Tencent on running the game and publishing the game here. So we've added a synchronous PvP mode, whereas PvP was asynchronous in the global build. We've added other things like more sort of RPG progression systems, more sort of daily quests and retirement and other things, and we're continuing to build this out over time. So the build now in Asia is quite different, and we're looking into expanding that now beyond China and talking about how to do that. So it's been great for us, and in terms of live operations, live programs are really the lifeblood of revenue for us on FIFA Mobile. Now, what is a live program? A live program is basically an event that runs for a fairly long duration of time, sometimes a week, sometimes 2 or 3 weeks, with sort of mini games and other quests and grinding sort of within that, within that event, within that program. Those programs are themed. A lot of time they're themed on real-world events or holidays or other themes. We had, for example, a Copa America live program running. We had Team of the Season, Team of the Year, World Cup, etc. But in addition to uniquely engaging in the game and creating unique sort of goals, there are also unique player cards that players can chase. A lot of times that are higher power, and Vladimir talked about selling power as well. We sell OBR, which is basically our universal measure of power, and this is something we try to sell, but we try not to linearly power creep it, but also create more differentiation with team chemistry and other things, create special editions of our players that we can chase in these live programs. And the interesting thing is about this program, or these programs in general, is that we've actually been able to get App Store featuring just based on program design itself, which was kind of a new thing for us. We always thought that if we approached Apple for featuring, we would have to design a cool new feature, but a lot of the programs are so unique in themselves and in how players behave within the programs that Apple actually gave us repeat featuring just because of the programs or because of the sporting event that the program mirrored. So that was really cool for us. However, it wasn't always that great for us, right? Upon launching programs, one of the things that we saw when we started launching programs in China was that players were consuming programs very quickly. We had an issue with spend velocity. We had an issue with average daily spend in ARPDAU. And we wanted to dig into why this was happening, right? We looked at the data and we realized players were consuming pretty much all the content in our programs very fast. The content consumption velocity was very fast. Players were content saturated, and that's something that we looked at was percent of content saturation within 3 to 5 days. And for a program that's supposed to be running for 2 weeks, this is definitely not your design goal. So one of the things we did was we tried to design our own custom metric around measuring, how good are our programs at delivering sustained consumption rates over time, and what is the rate of change of consumption rate, over a player's sort of engagement with the program. And we created this metric, which we just called program efficiency, which is a very simple name. And what we saw early on was that, and the size of the dot here is basically the duration of the program. A lot of these programs were delivering low efficiency for us. They were average length programs, and we saw a lot of these players who would engage in the programs. They would come out, they would churn, or they would do something else in the game. And we decided to optimize this in a couple different ways. The first thing we realized is that content is king, right? And we talk a lot about content treadmills being bad sometimes. A lot of times we say content treadmill in a pejorative sense, and it's actually not a bad thing. And if you've got the right tools and tech to deliver more dense content, it's actually can be a really good thing for your game. So one of the things that we did was invest right away in our back-end sort of automation and content development. And we pivoted the dev team to focus a lot there. We actually changed the composition of the dev team to be able to deliver more content at a faster rate. So that's one thing that we did right away. The other thing that we did is just in the design of our programs, in the different nodes of the programs as players were progressing through them, we made sure that we distributed chase content evenly so that players were able to engage and chase different things at different stages of the program. So this was an easier change for us than pivoting the dev team, but it did bear fruit for us. Over time, what we saw even with programs that we ended up running for longer was that the efficiency of these programs was a lot higher. So these higher efficiency programs helped us to achieve better results over time and drive revenue more consistently. And as we've experimented and optimized this, it really has been a great thing for our team and a great motivating factor. It's one of the few foreign developed games that has been able to sustain in the top 20 to 30 grossing in China. Premium placement on WeChat and our relationship with Tencent has gotten better over time. And it's basically next to a couple other games, PES and NBA, it is the top grossing sports game in China. So this has been great for us, and this is why we're thinking now of how do we take this more broadly into other parts of the world. I'm going to go back a little bit more in time and talk about something from my Kabam days. And this was about identifying opportunity and really analyzing at a deep level what were the drivers of some of the success of our first-gen mobile games. So one of the great things about Kabam was Kabam really embraced the mindset of analytics and PM-driven game operations and using data to inform design. So that was never a roadblock. But we also were able able to dig really deeply with the help of data scientists and bigger analytics teams into the drivers of longer-term trends. And our LTV drivers project was one thing that we did which actually impacted both our live operations strategy and how we serviced our players, and also our entire development direction. So in the first generation mobile titles, we were able to generate a pretty high hit rate. Franchises that would gross 100 million or more were relatively, copious for us. And we were wondering why, because we looked at these games and we said, okay, these aren't that fun to play. The graphics aren't great. The strategy is very linear. So what actually was it? Is it just live operations and content, or is it something else, right? I think content could have been the easy answer here. But we wanted to look deeper than that. We wanted to see if there was actually anything underlying. So we took it upon ourselves to actually, and this was a lot of manual work, to create a large data set and taxonomy for us of the different types of hard currency spend, right? This was event-driven hard currency spend. This was systems-driven. This was content-driven, or this was live ops tools-driven, et cetera. And we did this over the span of 60 different client releases. So the data set ended up being massive. What we then did was we mapped that to the spend and transaction patterns of our players and tried to look back and see, with the use of logistic regression and some other techniques, whether what were the biggest sort of drivers of long-term LTV growth and short-term LTV growth. So the results that we found were actually quite surprising. And one of the biggest conclusions was that live ops tools actually were the biggest contributor to long-term LTV growth than even content itself. And this was actually something that took a while for me to wrap my head around. But when you think about it, it actually makes sense, right? The ability to repackage merchandise content in different ways, especially because all your users won't necessarily have all the content. Like, not everyone will have that content when it gets released. Being able to actually surface and expose that content to different players in different ways is a great way to drive long-term LTV growth than simply just releasing something new. So this was a pretty big conclusion for us. And it actually informed a lot of our development on Contest of Champions. This was one of our earlier conclusions, and when we were launching and preparing to launch Marvel, the FuseSparks backend was our live ops tool that we were going to use to service players. And investing and becoming more robust in this tool actually paid dividends down the line. We were able to build the FuseSparks backend to serve analytics, user acquisition, live operations, et cetera, into one tool. And it really had a positive effect on long-term LTV growth in Marvel. The other sort of conclusion, which actually came later once we sort of slotted Marvel into this study, was the importance of 7-day players, which we ended up calling regulars. And if you look at this graph over these games right here, what you'll see is on the y-axis, basically the propensity to churn. And then the different colors are players who play for different days. And you'll see 7 days is almost invisible on the chart. And that's because players who play for 7 days, very unlikely to churn. And this was true across our portfolio. This might actually be that surprising, right? Of course, players who are playing every day are not going to churn. But the corollary to this, which we found really interesting, was actually the difference between 6-day and 7-day players. If you looked at combining this with average daily spend of a 6-day and 7-day player, a 7-day player spent more than twice as much on a daily basis than a 6-day player. So we knew that these 7-day players, which we called regulars, were very, very important. So this actually created some change for us, because we were always thinking about pushing out new content and focusing on consumables over durables. And this is why a lot of users ended up calling us Kaskam, right? That was our nickname, because our App Store ratings weren't that high. Players complained a lot. They kept spending in the game, which seems to be a pretty common trend. But pivoting to focus on our regulars and creating 7-day behavior was something that we focused on more after this, right? Pivoting feature development to focus more on daily login calendars and more retention mechanisms, creating more rewards for 7-day play, et cetera. And this allowed us to continue driving LTV into more of the linear fashion versus asymptoting it. And this is something that I've taken with me as we move to EA, and we call them committed players at EA, but we strive to service them in a lot of the same way as we did at Kabam. So wrapping up, and I mentioned this before at the beginning when I said if you have the teams and the mindset in place, you can do really crazy things with data. And what it really has come down to for me is it really is a mindset, right? I've been fortunate to work at companies that have embraced data-driven decision making. I've also, been at companies where there have been challenges with data-driven decision making and this, kind of tension and dissonance between data and business and monetization versus creative, right? I've lived through the Battlefront fiasco where we almost had a knee-jerk reaction to saying, okay, nothing pay to win now, only monetize off of cosmetics, that's it. We're like, wait a second. I mean, maybe that makes sense for a business model where you're paying $60 up front, but for free to play, that's going to screw us. So we definitely shouldn't do that. But really, being able to invest in, sort of rapid experimentation, iterative design, and informing this by behavioral data will allow the creative process to really elevate itself and will allow dev teams to scale in ways that they never thought they could. Right? This is sometimes a challenge to create this mindset. And I've lived through these challenges, so I do have some thoughts on how to help create this. But what I will say is that when PMs and designers and analysts and creatives are all working together in this way and all actively questioning things and all have that sort of experiment hat on, it really creates a cool environment on a dev team. So how do you create that? And what are sort of my closing thoughts? The first thing I would say is that sophisticated tools, tech, and data actually enable sophisticated mindsets. And this is kind of counterintuitive. If you have the tools and tech and data in place, you'll actually be able to come up with answers and conclusions to questions that people didn't even know to ask. And that actually creates that sort of virtuous cycle on different roles in the dev team. The second thing I would say is that build tracking in teams that enable you to sort of dig deeply into what's going on. If you create this team and you create the ability to create answers to questions right away, and you hire the best people, you're going to be able to sort of come up with conclusions that are going to surprise other people, and it's going to create this mindset that I talked about before. Data is a great guide, but it's not the end-all be-all. Right? I've been fortunate to work with less data-driven teams and more data-driven teams. I've worked on console, mobile, and PC at this point. Teams like DICE and BioWare who are definitely more about the creative process, and I have immense respect for those teams. And hopefully, I think they've learned some things from us too in terms of how to approach free-to-play business models and how to explore the future. And lastly, question and stress test your perception of reality. As we get longer and longer in this industry, we tend to sort of default to some of these things that, these learnings and historical precedent in the past. It's important to always keep that critical mindset switched on and to continually stress test your perception of reality. If you've got the right people in place and the right data, no matter what that reality ends up being, you're going to be able to find the solution. So I would leave you guys with that, and hopefully we have time for a couple questions.
Sadly not. Unfortunately, I've got to move on. Devin, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. I can't stress enough how important, particularly the live ops thing, it just resonates for me. Over 20 years running games as a service, and that is the one thing I think really resonates. It's like live ops matters more than anyone realizes, and the data is essential. I'm interested in working with companies that don't use it, but that's another subject. On that note, thank you very much, Devin.